the series called The Gospel. It's week 3 of our gospel series. We looked at gospel perspective in week 1, that we need to have a perspective of the world that the Bible has, which is that humanity has a brokenness, a sinfulness to us. And that this sin in us is not a human problem, it's a cosmic problem. This sin entered the world through a cosmic battle between God and Satan, and so that's where it came from. So our sin, because of the cosmic problem, our sin needs a cosmic solution. So that's the perspective, that we can't solve our sin issues. We can't solve what's wrong with our humanity, with our souls. We need that fixed from the outside in, which is why God sent his son, it's God in flesh, Jesus, to rescue us through his death and resurrection. Last week we looked at gospel power, this power of the gospel. It's not good advice. It's not chicken soup for the soul. It's not 7 steps to a healthy marriage. The gospel is the power of God unto salvation. It saves, it restores, it redeems, and it transforms us. So we studied last week. It's really all that we need is the power of the gospel. And it is enough. It is enough for us. Whether you come in here as someone who's been raised in church and never left the church, or you're someone who never set foot in a church until a few weeks ago, that this gospel has the power to save even the vilest of sinners. And the Bible is evidence of that as we study throughout the scriptures. But this morning I want to look at gospel people. So if it's true that the gospel transforms sinners into saints, that it makes us a new kind of people, what kind of people is that? How then shall we live is the great question. If it's true, what does it look like to be gospel people? So I want to do some work on our context. And normally we do a lot of context on scripture because I think that's important for us to know where it's coming from, who it's written to, and who wrote it. But what happens sometimes, what gets lost, is our own context, where we've come from. So we've done this a couple of times in the past 5 years or so, but I want to take us back there to understand how we've landed where we've landed even today. So I want to talk about our context. A number of years ago, an author and essayist named David Foster Wallace was speaking at a commencement for a college, and he gave a great speech, but inside of it was this story he told that has been just told many times since. I want to clean it up. The language I'm going to clean up a little bit because it's David Foster Wallace, and if you know anything about him, he loves him a good cuss word. But here's what he says. He says, here's the story. There are these 2 young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys. How's the water?" And the 2 young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one looks over at the other and goes, "What the heck is water?" Thank you. I thought that was funny. So he's making the point that there is a stream that we all swim in, and we don't even recognize we're swimming in it. So what it takes sometimes is for us to understand our context, to understand the water we're swimming in. So this morning I want to talk about this particular sort of water that our culture is swimming in, and how if we don't understand that, we're going to make a complete mess out of this passage in 1 Peter chapter 2. So let's start back in 1929, the Great Depression. The Great Depression created a generation that was called the silent generation, which I'm just all for having another one of those. That would be awesome to have another one. But the silent generation, they came out of the greatest generation, and they were silent. They were traditionalists. They kind of just did the status quo. Because that's really all they knew. There wasn't much else to go with at that point. Not long after the Great Depression, World War II kicked off. And it ended in 1945. And as all those American soldiers, victorious, returned from war, they came back home to their wives or their girlfriends. And wouldn't you know it, 9 months later, a bunch of babies are born after that. And that's what's called the baby boom. And so there's a generation there called the baby boomer generation. It's people born from 1946 to 1964. How many of you are baby boomers? There's 76 million of you in the world today. Okay? Those are baby boomers. So the U.S., though, still young, really fledgling young infant compared to the rest of the world, now found itself as a great military superpower. But also because of how they had to use factories and things during World War II, and because women went to work, what happened was we're seeing an economy come back in the United States like we have never seen before. So now on the horizon Leaders see a chance for America not just to be a military superpower, but an economic superpower. And so they begin to engineer America towards that very end. They had a vision that created a new vision for America. So they began consulting economists, and Victor Lebo, in World War II, the economist after World War II, says this. He says, "Our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life, an American way of life, that we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals." Now watch this. "That we seek our spiritual satisfaction, ego satisfaction, in consumption." There's an intentional push post-World War II to tell Americans that you can satisfy your soul spiritually through the consumption of goods. That being a consumer is what would satisfy you. Now that's late 1940s when all that is coming out. But the problem was you've got a generation of Americans who were raised in the Great Depression who know nothing of the sort, who feel like consumption is excess. Why would you do that when I've got a pantry full of lima beans that we need to get through by 2025? So the shift now was, okay, so now they get marketers on board and they get public relations on board. Because you've got to shift the thrifty and economically conservative to become consumers. And so marketing rises. Radio, television, print ads, all of that changes. So much so that since then, in the 80 or so years since then, now we find ourselves where it's everywhere. We don't even recognize it. We're being manipulated mentally and emotionally and don't even recognize it. And now it's made its way into our social media. It's made its way into everything that we see. And the entire push is you better keep up. You better stay on trend. You better be ahead of the curve. And so we have all been born into that story. We've been born into the story of consumerism. Now, what's sad is that it has seeped its way into the church, and we can actually trace that back to around the same time frame. Around 1946 or so, 1946, 1964, again, the baby boomers, their tagline or their pseudonym was called the Me Generation. Baby boomers were called the Me Generation because their entire world was focused around me and mine and my comfort. And the phrase that became popular for the baby boomers was self-actualization or self-realization, self-fulfillment. And this became culturally more important than social responsibility. So we get Woodstock, we get the hippie movement, we get all of that happening because many young adults are self-actualizing. They're realizing who they actually are. And so then they begin to create a small world within their own world that's all about themselves. They're called the Me Generation. In fact, the baby boomers to this day have the highest divorce rates than any other generation before or since. The church started to recognize this kind of movement. And so in 1965, the Glass Church, we call it the Crystal Cathedral, Robert Schuller was the pastor. And he recognizes the power of radio, and then eventually TV, becomes one of the first televangelists. And Robert Schuller's big push was positive Christianity. Let me give you a couple of his famous taglines. First one is turn your scars into stars. And I have no idea what that means. I don't know what a star is instead of a scar. I know what a scar is. I don't know how it becomes a star. And here's his second one. It takes guts to get out of the ruts. 1960s. We're not talking 2020 churches trying to sell books and podcasts. We're talking his whole push was this Christianity has gotten too negative. We got to make it positive again. And so it became about dreaming and how God wants dreamers. And because of radio and TV, he gets vastly popular. One of his disciples was a man named Chuck Smith who started Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa, California. Biblically rooted at first and then started to see some different openings. And he discipled a man by the name of Lonnie Frisbee. Lonnie Frisbee was part of the Vineyard Church movement. And Vineyard began writing a number of the praise choruses that we used to sing back in the 80s and 90s at church. Remember that little white book with the red dove on it? That's where that came from. And we would sing those songs, but now those songs written for his church are now being marketed and sold to Christians around the United States. But in 1965, everything that was communal, everything that had to do with relationship and community all declined. We lost trust in government and leadership, and there's obvious reasons why in the late 1960s. Wealth and education and economy, everything began to crumble. So then a new generation comes on, these kids of the baby boomers. And they're growing up in a generation with shifting family loyalties, parents who both of them work, and all of their efforts are focused on careers and rising and finances and the economy. And so these baby boomers give birth to what we call the latchkey kids, or Generation X. People born from 1965 to 1980. How many of us are there here, Gen X? Yeah, here we are. Don't forget about us. So remember, we were the ones who came home to an empty house because mom and dad were both working. And really, for the first time in American history, mom and dad were both working. So we came home to fend for ourselves. So what we learned was how to protect ourselves, how to make sure we were fed, make sure we knew what we were doing. We did what we wanted to do. We rode our bikes for hours until the streetlights came on, and then we came home. Like, we ran our lives because we had to, because there was no one else there to tell us how to do it. So that generation eventually starts to understand. I love this phrase about the Gen X. We were born to hippies, but raised by yuppies. So I love that. But the values and culture of the baby boomer church wasn't appealing to Gen X anymore. It just wasn't doing what it once was. And so pastors started coming on the scene. One of them was a former businessman and a visionary named Bill Hybels. Bill Hybels launched Willow Creek Church in 1975. And it was influential. Books and seminars and conferences you would go to. And he had a vision for it. He had a vision for the structure of the church, for the systems of church. Just a brilliant, brilliant man. In 1975, that church was planted, and not more than 5 years later, there were 15,000 people in attendance in Willow Creek. One of his disciples was a man by the name of Rick Warren. Rick Warren pastored Saddleback Church in California, 1979, who moved from Fort Worth, Texas to Orange County, California, because he read some marketing reports. Church planters had marketers or people who would go out and do research, and the research was that Orange County, California was the fastest growing county in America, and not only that, it was the wealthiest growing county in America, and so he decided that's a perfect place to plant a church. And so Rick Warren did. He wanted to plant a church for the unchurched, and he had events like jacuzzis for Jesus, which I don't know how that works either, but maybe if your scars turn into stars in the jacuzzi, then it's for Jesus. He created a persona called Saddleback Sam. Saddleback Sam was the target audience for Saddleback Church. They defined, narrowed down, and that was the whole preaching, was, hey, if we narrow down your target audience, you can get them to come and be part of your church. Bill Bishop was a journalist who wrote an article called The Big Sort, and what he recognized in the late 70s, early 80s, was that people were beginning to sort themselves, to organize themselves, that places, cities, suburban areas were becoming homogeneous, meaning everybody looked the same, sounded the same. No longer was it a melting pot of the cities in America, and now everything was moving out to the suburbs. And the church recognized it. And the church started moving from the city center out to the suburbs as well. And the churches then saw themselves as a one-stop shop for the family, a place for your kids to go, a place for your teenagers to go. You could network, you could find some business, you could get some coffee at the coffee shop and buy a book at the bookstore. All of that was happening in the church because what also was rising was transit, interstates and highways. Technology was advancing. We had sound systems and audio amplifiers. And so because it wasn't uncommon for you to drive 30 minutes or 40 minutes to get to work, what's driving 45 minutes to get to church on a Sunday? So everything changed. The rise of the megachurch and huge churches that had everything to offer the family became the place to be. And you would drive. You would drive 45 minutes to get to this church because it had all of the things that you wanted. So you found a church in the 90s and 2000s not based on doctrine and conviction, but based on preference. Based on preference, and maybe affiliation, but mostly preference. So now, fast forward to 2025, and you've got podcasts and YouTube, You've got churches streaming services. You've got the rise of social media and celebrity pastors, which is a complete oxymoron, and rise of these churches. And so here's the truth. You can wake up on a Sunday, get dressed if you want to. You don't have to. And you can choose that morning which church's worship you want to listen to, and then which church's pastor you want to listen to that morning. And if your church preference, that pastor maybe is out of town, he's going somewhere else, or some youth guy to fill in, you're like, I don't know about that. No offense, Cody, you do a great job. But then you can find some other, like your Plan B church online to find. You can have the best of both worlds, all without leaving the comfort of your living room. And COVID made all of that peak. So here's what I'm saying. The water we swim in is consumerism. The water we swim in as Christians in the American culture is consumerism. Here's what Eugene Peterson says about our culture, that American culture is probably the least Christian culture we've ever had because it's so materialistic and so full of lies. The problem is, people have been treated as consumers for so long, they don't know any other way to live. And when I think as pastors and elders and leaders, that's the temptation, is to market, is to get you to consume. The church has become a form of entertainment. It's become something we attend rather than a people to whom we belong. But the biblical church was never set up as a thing to attend. You'll never read that you should go to church. Instead, the invitation is to be part of a church, to belong to a people, not to attend one. But if the gospel has transformed us, like we said it has the power to do so, then what that means is we have new water to swim in now. We're no longer swimming in the water of the world, which is where we step in 1 Peter. 1 Peter, Peter has written this letter to churches among the Roman Empire in Asia Minor. They're under persecution. Emperor Nero, the great Rome fire has happened. Nero is angry, needs somebody to blame it on, so he blames it on the church. He blames it on Christians. And so now the whole Roman Empire is after the Christians. They're having underground churches, trying to figure out where they can do business. Can they do business if they know they're Christians? With all of that happening, Peter, of all people, Peter, writes 2 letters to the church in the Roman Empire in Asia Minor to tell them to keep going in the midst of persecution. And he tells them to not retaliate, which sounds nothing like Peter. Peter loves him some retaliation. For 3.5 years he followed Jesus. Jesus' constant rebuke to Peter was, stop it. Just stop. Shut up and stop. Just stop. Jesus gets arrested the night before he is crucified, and Peter takes out a fishing knife and chops off a Roman guard's ear with it. Like he's going to stop the entire battalion with this fishing knife. And Jesus, what are you doing? And he tells Peter, if you're going to live by that, you will die by that. Later that night, Peter denies knowing Jesus 3 different times. All that bold brashness eventually just runs away from him in shame. He sees the resurrected Jesus, but still is wrestling with all of it. And there comes a morning when he just decides he's done. He doesn't measure up. He can't do it. That's just not who he is anymore. He decides, I'm going to go back to fishing. At least I was good at that. Gets on a boat to go fish. Even that's not going well. Jesus shows up on the shore, tells him to do it a better way. And so Peter does. He catches a bunch of fish, and Peter comes in. And that morning, having breakfast, Jesus restores Peter back to ministry. And something happened that morning. Something with gospel power happened that morning. And this man who was brash and retaliatory and yet cowardly has now found a new lease. He's found a new perspective. 50 days later, he preaches the boldest sermon you will ever read in the book of Acts. And he leads this movement of new churches. Now, it's not perfect. He has his issues. But he writes this letter to tell the churches in the Roman Empire and Asia Minor, don't give in and don't go back to fishing. Don't go back to your old way. It's not who you are anymore. He spends the first chapter of 1 Peter reminding them about the gospel, reminding them of this power of the gospel that transforms. In the first 8 verses of chapter 2, he's like, this is what the world is like. And then we pick up in verse 9, but you. So this is distinct now. That's what the world is like. That's the water they're swimming in. Here's your new water. Now here's what's interesting. This you here is not singular, it's plural, which makes this a very southern book of the Bible. Saying, but y'all, that's what he's saying. But y'all, but all y'all. And let me just say, I grew up in Florida, and I told myself I would never say y'all. I would never. That is ignorant. It's just so uneducated. And I'm at the point now where my phone autocorrects to y'all because that's what I say most of the time. So thanks, Harrison. So thanks for that. Still not wearing cowboy boots, but here we are. Mike say y'all. So he says, but y'all, all of you churches, all of you Christians in the Roman Empire and Asia Minor, says all y'all are a chosen race. Now, chosen, we can do some work on that theologically later, but I want to focus on the word race. This word race means that you now share a new bloodline. You have new DNA running through you. You're a unseen, a brand new race, a brand new kind of people. You're a brand new family. The connection you have now, because of Jesus, is a whole new bloodline. Then he defines this bloodline in the next phrase, a royal priesthood. This bloodline comes from the throne. It's kingly. You're royalty, but a priesthood. Now, this language comes from the Old Testament, those who would work in the temple. But priests, their main job was to be an intermediary between the people and God. So they would show God what the people were like, but they're meant to show people what God is like. And they do that through their behavior, through their conduct. They're called to high standards. They've been set apart. You're a brand new people, a brand new bloodline, and a kingly bloodline in which you're showing people what God is like. And then he calls them a holy nation. Holy meaning set apart. And he's saying, now you're under new government. You got new boundary lines. You've got new rules, a new way of operating. You're a new family. You're a royal priesthood. And you're a brand new country. You're a brand new nation. And then he calls them a people for his own possession. That you now are possessed by someone. You're owned by, you have someone now. Some of your translations say a peculiar people. That's what it means. He's going to explain more about that later. And here's the reason. That y'all may proclaim the excellencies of him who called y'all out of darkness and into his marvelous light. The purpose is that we proclaim the glory of this Jesus who saved us through the gospel. Then look at verse 10. He's going to explain what it means to be a people of his own possession. Remember, once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. The water is different now. You were once swimming in a lost sea, trying to figure it all out, trying to figure out who you belong to. You were an orphan. And now he's saying, no, you're no longer that. Now you've been brought into the family. Now you're a people, God's own people. Now he's going to share how that happened. Remember, once you didn't have mercy, but now you have. The gospel of Jesus has done more than get you into heaven. It's made you a brand new people and a people together. Then he begins verse 11 with the word beloved. He's called them a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, and now he calls them beloved. So now he's saying, and it wasn't just utilitarian. You're not like God's vacuum. You're not God's washing machine. You're his bride. This brand new people, and you are beloved. I want you to recognize, he has yet to tell them how to live. He has yet to tell the Christians under the Roman Empire in Asia Minor what to do. What he's told them is who they are. Because identity always produces behavior. You cannot behave your way into a new identity. Your behavior confirms your identity. So what he's saying now is, I'm going to remind you who you are. And God does the same thing in Exodus where he gives the 10 Commandments. He reminds them who he is and who they are, and then he gives them what to do. So he says, beloved, I urge you. So now here's the first call to action. But again, he goes back to, but you remember, as who you are. You are sojourners and exiles. A sojourner is a traveler, someone who's just there for a short term. So think somebody who rents an Airbnb. Like it's not your house. Nothing parties like a rental, but that's not your house. So remember that. You're just there for a short term. So what he's saying is, I want to remind you, holy nation, royal priesthood, chosen race, remember, you don't live here. You're just passing through, and then he calls them exiles. So some of your translations say aliens. Just means you're out of place. You're not where you should be. And you feel it. So he says, hey, before I'm going to tell you what to do, let me remind you again who you are. Chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people of God's own possession. You are beloved. You're sojourners, and you are exiles. And he says, I urge you to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. The first thing he calls the Christians to do is to avoid, to run from passions of the flesh. This is the old way. This is the lusts and desires of the old water we used to swim in. So he's saying, listen, as gospel people, as people who believe the gospel to be true, we no longer operate according to our fleshly desires. We're no longer animals driven by our desires. We now have self-control. We can now control that. We don't have to say everything we think. We don't have to do everything we feel. Now we have a new filter. We have new water that we are swimming in. But then look at the reason. I love it. It's not because those are bad, because it makes you a bad person. Look at his reason. Avoid them, abstain from them, which wage war against your soul. Isn't that compassionate from Peter? Hey, don't do the things you used to do because you'll get in big trouble. No, because they're killing your soul. They will kill your soul. They will rot you from the inside out. This isn't about right and wrong. It's not about good behavior and bad behavior. This is about the health of our souls. We no longer swim in that water. To get back in that water will kill you from the inside out. So he's told us what to avoid. Now look at verse 12. Instead, keep your conduct among the Gentiles. Peter uses the phrase Gentiles to talk about anyone who's not a Christian. Keep your conduct, keep your behavior, keep your actions among the non-Christians honorable. So when they speak against you as evildoers, they're going to see your good deeds and glorify God when he visits, when he comes. So what I want to focus on this morning is, well, what does that look like? What does it look like to have honorable conduct? What does that even look like? What does it mean to be gospel people? For Peter, who's writing this letter to Christians, he's telling them how to live it out now. He gave them the gospel. Here's how you live it out. Now watch. You're going to hate it. You are going to absolutely hate what he says first. Verse 13, be subject, submit, yield to, for the Lord's sake, to every human institution, whether it be the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by God to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. Isn't this interesting? Because Peter doesn't first go to, hey, you know how you need to be a Christian? You got to make sure you read your Bible every day. And make sure you pray and do your devotions. Make sure you raise your hands at the right time of the song, like not in the weird time. Make sure you know when to kneel and when to stand. Make sure you know all of that. The first thing he goes to is submit to governing authorities. That's wild to me, especially in context, because you know who he's talking about? Nero. Nero. Now, I know some of you thought the last 4 years were bad. It wasn't Nero bad. And some of you think the next 4 years are going to be bad. It won't be Nero bad. But Peter's call is, I don't care who it is. God put them there. So the first mark of a gospel person is that we submit to governing authorities. Don't you love that? You don't. That's what he says to do. How do you set yourself apart? What is it? If it's true, if the gospel is true, what's the first indicator for the world to know? That you don't talk trash about the president. How are we doing? Don't you love it? It gets worse, but that's where he starts, is right there. And he says, verse 15, for this is the will of God. This is God's will. That by doing good, you're going to put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. How do you silence ignorant people? Do you debate with them on social media? Has that silenced them? Which then begs the question, which one of you is ignorant? Has it helped you silence the voice of foolish people with your bumper stickers and your flags? No. What's the call? It's the will of God that through our good, honorable conduct, that they'd have nothing to say against the church. So he says, live as people who are free. Now, are Christians free in Rome? No. This isn't political, this is spiritual. If you're actually spiritually free, live like it. But don't use that freedom as a cover up for evil. So you don't get to say, well, as a Christian. No. Instead, use your freedom for good. Verse 17, honor everyone. Love the brotherhood, that's the Christians. Fear God, honor the emperor. Notice the words. Does it say to love the emperor? No. Does it say to fear the emperor? No. It just says to honor him. And we can do that. We can do that. And now it continues in verse 18. Servants, submit, be subject to, yield to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing. When mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. So he's starting to narrow the scope. Do you see it? Governing authorities, and now he's like, hey, and your bosses. And some of you are like, no, I'm good. I can honor the president. It's my boss I got a problem with. All right. Honor them with respect. How do we set ourselves apart? Now, let me make it real personal. You know who else this refers to? Teachers and coaches. And let's get real bad. Referees and umpires. Like for real, for real. Because when you go to your kid's game and you start getting in the shouting match with all of the other parents at the umpire who's making $20 for that game, you're swimming in the same water the world's swimming in. Honor governing authorities. Honor those who are masters to us, those who are above us. He goes on to say, listen, if Christ suffered, what you think you're going to get out of that? I mean, you're going to suffer too. And he says, even the unjust ones. Because here's my favorite thing that happens when we have conversations like this. Someone always goes, yeah, but what about if? I've never had somebody who's actually walking in integrity ask me a what about if question. It's always someone looking for a loophole. The what about ifs will always take care of themselves if you do the obvious things. Well, what if he asked me to go kill my wife? Come, for real? Is that a conversation we're having? Don't kill your wife. Don't. Instead, I mean, it's obvious. Let's not get into all the exceptions until we're really good at the rules. Speaking of rules, here's where it gets worse. Let's go to chapter 3, verse 1. Likewise, just like the governing authorities and our bosses, wives, be subject to your own husbands. And now you're like, bro, you had me at president and boss. I'm going to draw the line right here. The word is likewise. Okay, so as if you're following God, in the will of God, all of that. Wives, be subject to your own husbands. Submit yourself to and yield to. Now pay attention, to your own husband. Not your neighbor's husband. Not every man on the face of the earth. I want to be clear on that. We don't have the right or authority over every woman in the world. That's not how the Bible sets it up. The Bible is set up to actually uplift the woman, to defend her. So please do not take these things out of context and talk to women degradingly as if you have some kind of God-given authority over them. You don't. Women, wives, submit to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word. So there's your what if he doesn't obey? Even if he doesn't, that they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. Now there's plenty of Proverbs about wives and their words, and what it sounds like and what it feels like and what God recommends the husband to do. In one case, God tells the man, it's better for you to die alone in the desert than to be married to a quarrelsome woman. And he says, without a word. Amen, husbands? Don't do it. Don't you say it. That they may be won. Now watch this. He doesn't say that they will be won. It's not a vending machine, ladies. Well, I was doing all the right things and he's still being a jerk. Okay, well, maybe he wasn't one. But that's not why we do what we do. We do what we do because we're swimming in new water now. And here's what else I recognize. I recognize how countercultural this is. And I recognize that some of you ladies are already offended. And I get it. Because the water of the world is telling you to be offended when someone tells you to submit to your husband. But the gospel water is telling you it's safe to do that. And I'll show you why here in a second. It says you might have won them by conduct of their wives. Verse 2. When your husbands see your respectful and pure conduct. Now, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair, the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear. Okay, so I don't think this is about, hey, women, you shouldn't wear makeup or gold jewelry or braid your hair. I think it's about manipulation and context. I think it's about you getting your husband to do something you want him to do, to be won over. Well, maybe if I just dressed differently, if I put this on, if I wore more makeup or less makeup, or maybe if I worked out more. And here's what Peter says in verse 4. No, let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, to which half of you say, I've got neither of those. I am neither quiet nor gentle. I know. Trust me, I know. But listen to this. Does the gospel have power or does it not? Does it have power? Does it have power to take the most aggressive, loud woman and root her in humility? Does the gospel have power to do it? And I say it does. I say it does. Here's what you need to hear, ladies. Those two words, quiet or gentle and quiet spirit, are the same two words Jesus uses to describe himself in Matthew chapter 11. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, for I'm gentle and lowly in heart. I have a quiet spirit. And he says, you can come to me and you will find rest for your souls. So ladies, let me ask you this question. Can your husbands find rest for their souls in you? You should ask him that today. And then let him be honest about it. And again, I know how everything in the world is saying not to do that. That's not the water we swim in anymore. We're a different race now. We have a different bloodline. We're a holy nation, a royal priesthood. Everything is different for us. So let's just pray, and we'll go home after that verse. So I feel like it's a good time just to stop and not keep reading. Verse 7, likewise, husbands. So we've done submitting to governing authorities, submitting to your boss, wives, submit to your husbands. Likewise, husbands, just if we're talking about submission, if we're talking about being subject, here's what he says. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives. And some of you, that's just where you need to stop right there. Honestly. Quit running away. Live with your wife. Live together with your wives in an understanding way. And then all the men in the room are like, what? I don't understand anything about that species of human. I have nothing. This understanding, this word comes from knowledge. So here's what Peter is saying. I want you to live with her as if you actually know her. Like intimately know her. And here's why this is so countercultural to the churches in the Roman Empire. Because women were possessions to men then. He's saying, you know what's distinct about a Christian husband? That his wife is not a possession. She is someone to be loved and known. To know her. To know what she likes and what she doesn't. To know what makes her feel anxious, what makes her feel celebrated. To actually know her. Showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel. And that should not be offensive. I hate that that's offensive to some of you women. Because it's true, isn't it? Like physically, anatomically, biologically, not for all of us, but for some of us, for most of us, like it's how God set the world up. And here's why it's so important. Because men, you need to understand, no matter how strong you think your wife is, it is your call to protect and defend her. Not to talk about her at lunch with your buddies. Not to talk about what you've done with her and how great last night was and how long it's been since. That's not honoring her as the weaker vessel. That we defend and we protect and we stand up for her and for her name's sake. And that's completely countercultural. Why? Since they are heirs with you in the grace of life. They're co-partners with you. That your prayers may not be hindered. And so now in verse 8, Peter's going to summarize all of it. He begins with the word finally. Finally, what he means is in summary, or to sum it all up, to put a bow on it, what he's saying is all of that takes us here. So finally, all of y'all, husbands, wives, bosses, servants, governors, and people under that authority, all of you. You know what it's like to swim in new water? You know what it's like to be a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, to be God's people? First, he says, have unity of mind. Some of your translations say be harmonious, and that's a great way to understand it. Is that we're all playing instruments, and we might be playing different notes, but we're on the same page. Be harmonious. Live in harmony with one another. All of it comes down to this. Secondly, have sympathy. Sympathy literally means to feel along with, to feel what someone else feels, to take the time to know what they're actually feeling. Third, have brotherly love, which means we love like family. We love like we actually belong to each other. We aren't goods to be consumed or products to be used. Have a tender heart. Literally in the Greek, it says have strong bowels, which some of you, that might be a command for you to have stronger bowels. The bowel for the Greek and Roman understanding is that's where the tender heart of emotion is. It's, when you say, I just felt it in my guts, that's where that comes from. And so now the call is to be tender, to have a tender, kind, good heart, tender affection. And finally, he wraps all up with, and a humble mind, or to have humility. Be harmonious, have sympathy, love like family, be tender towards one another, and be humble. The best definition of humility I've ever heard is from C.S. Lewis, who says, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. And that flies in the face of everything our culture is telling us, doesn't it? Because the me generation gave birth to the latchkey kids who learned to defend themselves. To think of yourself less? We don't even know what that even looks like because we're so consumed with thinking of ourselves. We swim in this water of thinking of ourselves more. It's called consumerism. And so as I walked through 1 Peter 2 and 3, you had pushback, didn't you? But how much of your pushback came back down to, but what about me? It's exactly why we don't like this. It's why we have a hard time living as gospel people. The me and mine of our culture is clashing with the y'all and all y'all of the Bible. Because if it's me, I'm going to protect me at all costs. But to be a gospel person means I'm focused on the all y'all. I belong to somebody. And if you go back through the things we're commanded to do in 1 Peter 2 and 3, how are you going to do that? How are you always going to honor the governor or the president or the authority? How are you always going to honor your boss and the teachers and the coaches? How are you always going to submit to your husband? How are you always going to respect and honor your wife? How else are we going to do that? Because you cannot do that alone. You've tried, haven't you? But how else are we going to do that? We need this. Everything is calling us to be gospel people. And the world is growing increasingly anti-gospel. I don't mean anti-Christian, I mean anti-gospel. Even the church has become anti-gospel. And we need people to remind us of the good news of Jesus. Everything in the world is telling us there's a better life if we would just exercise more or diet more or read this book or take this pill, listen to this podcast, take this shot, find that person and just find ourselves. And the church has bought it. The church has bought it because everything is about me and my preferences, isn't it? Some of you cannot believe where you're sitting right now today, like literally, because the chairs are different. And that's not how you prefer it. And it was hard for you to sing. It's hard for you to listen. Well, I don't like that song. I don't like the way she sang that song. I don't like what he's wearing. I don't like what they sound like. I don't like this view. I don't like how long this. It's preference, isn't it? It's always been preference. Clothes and schedule, it's the same water. So here's the part of the sermon where I'm supposed to tell you should be in a small group so you can finally find gospel people. I'm not going to tell you that. I wrestle a lot with small groups. I wrestle with the purpose of them. I wrestle with how we do it. I wrestle with a lot of it. So I love small groups, and I think there's a purpose to them. And I think they're good, really, really good for some people. But I want to tell you this. Everything we do as a church is set up to get you in a relationship with somebody else. Even the way the chairs are set up. The chair guy didn't set them up wrong. This came from the top. Because there's something that happens when you come and sit in long rows. You know who you are, because you come in late and leave early. Because you don't want to talk to anybody. And then something tragic happens in your life, and you get mad at the church for not reaching out. I love you. We never knew who you were. This church, I've been a number of churches. This church and these people are the most loving, kind, gracious, generous people I've ever been around in my life. Not to say we don't get it wrong sometimes, but some of that responsibility falls on us. It is why we do small groups and why we do our classes at tables. It's why we offer classes and care groups. It's why we do meet and greet. I know some of you hate it, but it's why we do it. We want you to be seen. We want you to be connected to a people, not just attend an event. This is about becoming a people. So Peter has told us what it looks like to be a gospel person is submission to authorities and our bosses, teachers, coaches, respecting your husband, loving your wife. And the world is telling us everything completely opposite, which means to be gospel people, we need gospel people. Man, if we're going to do this thing, we're going to need some other people to help us. Because 95% of your life is telling you the opposite. And back to what Peter said about our souls, but our souls are dying from the inside out. We're dying because of it. This is not a solo sport. Like following Jesus is not boxing or tennis. It's football. You need people to block for you, and people to catch for you, and people to pass, and people to defend. Like, we need all of that. Maybe for some of you that doesn't help you. Maybe it's an orchestra. You're not Jimi Hendrix. I don't know what it is, but we need each other. It's how it's all been set up from the beginning. And so no, I'm not going to demand you be in a small group because for some people it doesn't work. But I will tell you this, if you're in a small group, you better make sure that's a gospel-centered small group. These people have given you an hour, 45 minutes today. I just don't want you to waste it. So here's what I want to do. As Mallory comes up, I want to give us a couple of different invitations this morning as we wrap up here pretty quickly. I'm going to call out our small group leader. If you just stand where you are so people can see you, because if you're interested in a small group, I want you to see what we have. So our ladies' small group is Elizabeth Wilson. Elizabeth's in the back here. That's Elizabeth. So ladies, single ladies. You can go back there for her. Young adults is Meredith and I, so college age, you can come find us. Meredith's down here. She's the pretty one. And then Kyle, if you stand up, Kyle does our young professionals group, like late 20s through 30s. So if you're in that kind of single, trying to figure it all out, you want to meet someone, that's a good place to start. And then our young marriage group, Jay Nelson's upstairs. Jay's running our cameras today. Jay and his wife, Jen. There's Jen. Jennifer's right there. You're recently married, maybe in your first 5-7 years of marriage, and gosh, you need help with it. Love for you to meet Jen. Jared Whitson, yeah. Jared and Carol Ann lead a group for late 20s and 30s and 40s, whoever. Jared, love for you to be with them. Just a fun group who I think asks really, really hard questions. So I love that about them. And then we've got, where's Danny Seacrest? Danny Seacrest and Harrison. You got to stand, Danny. And Harrison Churchman and Katrina. They lead 40s and so, yeah. People got married with children? Is that what you said? Okay. Not the Al Bundy. Okay. David Wilkerson. Where are you? David Wilkerson, Mark McClendon. Yep. Yeah. They lead our 60s and 70s and 80s and late 50s. Love for you to be part of that. That's a huge growing group. Love for you to be a part of their group as well. And then Brad Kelly and Jeff Underwood. I think Brad's serving upstairs. Jeff's in the back. Jeff's the one that gave you coffee this morning, leading a group for 40s and 50s as well. We just love, if you're looking for that, we'd love for you to be a part of it. But I want to make this second invitation to you. So I'm going to have all of our elders and staff, you just come down and stand on the sides of the stage. Elders and wives, staff, and your spouses, if you'll come down as well. If you bow your heads and close your eyes, I want to give us a couple different invitations today. Maybe for you, you've had enough interaction with Christian people that has given you a bad taste in your mouth for the gospel. And you're saying, man, if that's really true, then how could I? How could they? I want you to know that we're all trying to figure the gospel out and what it means to us personally, and we don't get it right all the time. But the power of the gospel doesn't rest in the people, it rests in Jesus. And so if you're ready this morning to give your heart over, to decide to follow him, to give into the good news of Jesus, that all of your sins, past, present, and future, have been fully, freely, and forever forgiven by the shed blood of Jesus in the empty tomb, I'd love for you to come down at some point and talk to somebody and be able to do that. But then to the rest of the room, I want to speak to you in this way. I think maybe there are people in our room who need to become gospel people. Right, like maybe as we run through this list of things, it's just hard to check those boxes. Well, we're all working at it. But there has to be a moment when you decide, I'm going all in on this thing. That's what I want to be. That's what I'm called to be. If that's you today, you can come forward and talk to one of our elders. You can come kneel here at the altar and have that conversation with the Lord, honestly saying, I believe the gospel saves me, but gosh, I don't live like it. I don't treat people that way. I'm swimming in the water of the culture still. I want to get in the other water. There's another group of people here this morning who you've just had a really hard time connecting to other people. And I'm sorry. And I don't want to offend you, but I do want to say some of that you're going to have to take some onus for today. And maybe you need to come forward and just talk to an elder saying, I've tried. I don't know what else to do. Can you help me connect? Can you help me find? I feel like I'm swimming alone. Maybe you feel like you're just going back and forth between the two streams of water. And you just need someone to know it and to walk with you. These men and women walk with people that would make your stuff look like child's play. You won't be surprised by it. So I'm going to pray. If you need to come and give your heart over to Jesus to receive the gospel, I want you to come. If you need to come and just confess that you haven't been living like it, that you're back in the water of the culture, I'd love for you to come and confess and walk in that. Maybe you just need to find connection. You need help finding that. I'd love for you to come this morning. I'm going to pray and give you a safe time just to come. I'll give us a benediction, get us dismissed after that. So Father, you've called us to something, and you've rescued us from the power of darkness into the domain of the marvelous light of your Son, Jesus. And there are some of us today in the room who haven't yet moved from the darkness into the light, and today you're calling them, and they're ashamed, or they're afraid, or they're nervous about it. But just pray you give a peace, give a strong call, a conviction on their heart through your Spirit that would draw them to you. But there are some of us today, God, who need to come and confess. We need to repent that we've made this about us. We've made church about us. We've made our small group about us. We've made our D group about us. We love to share about us. And we've never actually stopped to consider someone else, to sympathize, to show brotherly love. And if there's anyone here today, God, who needs to find connection, who's desperate for it, I pray you'd give them the courage to come out of that shell and take steps towards it. Because, God, we as a church want to be gospel people, people who believe it's actually true. And that the world looks at us, it's like, how? How do all of those people do that? Why are those two people there? Why are they hanging out? And our response would be, because we believe the gospel to be true. So make us a gospel people, continue to root us in the truth of the empty tomb. It's in Jesus' name I pray.